It's what you want to do.
Good afternoon, everybody. Wonderful to be here with you. To start things off, I'm going to ask you to join with me. For those of you that haven't opened your Coke yet, I welcome you to open your Coke and taste the feeling with me. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jakubowski, and I have the pleasure of being the general manager for the Coca-Cola company in the Baltic countries, in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and I also have Poland in my remit. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to take you a little bit behind the scenes into the world of Coke a little bit. It's a big brand, and probably there's a little bit of curiosity about how we do what we do. And so what I'd like to do is share with you some insights about how we, from behind the scenes, think about our brand. It's 130 years old, 1886. May 8th is its birthday. Yes, so opportunity for you to celebrate with us on Sunday. Actually, it was my birthday yesterday, so I always say that we're a great fit. We're two Tauruses. But it's a 130-year-old brand, and I'll come back and talk about why that's relevant. The two most recognized shapes in the world: the contour bottle and the common egg. Coca-Cola is in more countries than the UN has representation. The two most known words in the world: Coca-Cola and the word okay. 94% of the world's population know the brand. 94%. That's amazing. This was our logo in 1886. An accountant, not a marketer, an accountant created the Sanskrit. The logo, actually, I should have put 16 there, obviously. I used this slide a little bit, so I didn't change it to 16. This is our logo today. So you've got a brand that's 130 years old. The package, that sexy contour shape, that shape is 100 years old. Its logo, 130 years old. I always, when I talk to marketing groups, I always say, what an amazing challenge, whereby, in essence, you can't really touch your product, your packaging is more or less set, and you can't touch your logo. I used to work for Procter Gamble for many years. And when I was in marketing, our whole jobs for every 3 to 5 years was to kind of refresh the brand, come up with a new logo tip, and perhaps update the packaging. Here, we ultimately are talking about a brand where a lot of the marketing mix is somewhat fixed, not entirely. And so what we're going to talk about is, how do we innovate? How do we stay relevant if that much of what we own in terms of our product and our assets are quite fixed? So I talked about the product being 130 years old. It was created by a pharmacist, a guy by the name of John Pemberton. He originally created the syrup as a stomach remedy. And today, it's all natural flavors, no added preservatives. Consumed 1.8 billion times a day. So what is it that the brand stands for? And ultimately, at the heart, at the DNA of the brand, yes, it's a great refreshing drink. I always say on ice with a lemon. At least that's the way I like to drink it. But at the heart of the brand is the idea of happiness, the idea of optimism, the idea of being there in moments of joy. When do you have those moments of joy? Usually with friends and family. And so the vision is, how do we ultimately be along in your life, be along with you in your moments of joy? How do we create a compelling way to be a part of your life? So let me start to go a little bit into what I talked about, which is the back door, the kitchen. How do we think about the brand, and how is it that we've ultimately, for 130 years, been able to keep it as the largest consumer brand in the world? So, like many brands, there's a core target of who you ultimately are talking to, who the brand most connects with. And for us, it's teens. Why? 2 reasons. One, it's when most of us really start to create brand affinity in our teens. By the way, I'll come back and talk a little bit about it, because there's a stage in your teens where you also reject. But then, so there's different aspects of how we connect with teens. But ultimately, it's when you create your brand, your first brand love. And secondly, as a teen, it's actually when you consume the most liquid in your life. So when we look at liquid consumption, anything, water, tea, coffee, perhaps beer, wine, any liquid that you consume during your teen years, between 12 and 19, that's when you're at your highest daily consumption. And then the curve kind of goes down for the rest of your life. So ultimately, it's where the biggest opportunity is in terms of consumption. Now, teens are at our focus, but it's not easy. They're a pretty demanding group, and they're a group that changes over time, and their demands change. And so for us, it's, how do you stay relevant? And in order to stay relevant, particularly in today's world, how do you break through the clutter when ultimately everything communicates and everyone communicates? I know that a lot of you have spent time listening to different presentations about how the digital world is changing things, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But in today's day and age, if you look at the amount of content created, there is more content being created by you, the consumers, than we, the brand owners. And so how is it that we steer through that to ensure that we get positive, relevant messaging? And so there's 2 things that I want to focus on today. One, which is, I think there's 2 reasons why Coke has stayed the positive brand it has been, and has stayed so big and at the top of its category for 130 years. And one is because it always has a point of view. So if I look back to the 1940s, it was the first brand ever to use women in advertising. Every sort of decade, the brand refreshes itself. It takes an inner look at itself and says, what's relevant? Are we still relevant? In the 80s, there was a big element in the US where there was a lot of tension. Racism was high. There wasn't a lot of integration in society. And Coca-Cola ran one of the most classic ads in its portfolio of advertising ever, which is what's called the Mean Joe Green ad. Took a black football player with a young little boy, and the two of them connected over a Coke. Pretty bold to run an ad at a time when tension was at its highest. So having a point of view, I think, is one of the things that's helped us stay relevant. The other thing I believe that helps us stay relevant is really ensuring that we're really ultimately at the core of insights with our consumer, that we're close to them, that we understand their needs, and we're adapting to their needs. That doesn't necessarily mean product formulation. It means how we connect and engage. So if we look at teens today, they are hungry for several things. One, a positive, uplifting future. They're hungry for authenticity. For them, it's critical to hear not only about success, but they want to hear about failure. There's no way you got to where you were without any mistakes. They want to hear about those mistakes. For them, that makes you real. And so tapping into these insights helps you then figure out how you can create your communication and your engagement strategies around that. And it's not easy for big manufacturers that are used to doing things in simple ways like traditional media platforms. So we know that everybody talks today about multi-screening, that often many of us have 2 to 3 screens open at any time, and teenagers are flowing more and more to things like mobile as their core screen. So how do we create that breaking through the clutter in all of this? And so what used to be us controlling the messaging is now really about how do we channel our messages so that ultimately we're creating the essence of content, and those that love our brand are in essence creating the balance of content and really engaging and creating that ultimate viral effect in terms of bringing more engagement to not just with us, but with their friends and family. So the public era was when it was things like television and outdoor advertising, and it was very one-directional. And then the internet came along and we got into the social era, where it was all about, ultimately having internet websites and infographics and being on Facebook. But really, where brands and where Coca-Cola very much is shifting to is how do we create this personalization? How do we create a relationship with you? How do we create a dialogue with you? And then ultimately, the ultimate pinnacle of brand love is how do we create some intimacy? And that's ultimately the challenge for brands is how do you continue to move through that cycle? So in the old world, it was reach and awareness and engaging audiences and, reading the Nielsen data and reading GfK data and getting your GRP analysis from your media houses. And now it's all about relevance and experience, building intimacy, managing big data. I think every week I sit in meetings where people ask the question, okay, if GRPs was television, what's the single measure in the digital world? And there doesn't seem to be yet any consensus on what that single measure could be. In fact, most people would debate, is single measure really the right way to look at the world of digital, given how complex it is? And complex, not in the sense of bad complexity, but diverse complexity. So, with that as backdrop, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you into the thinking of the new campaign that we launched back in January and February. So I mentioned that sort of every 10 years, the brand kind of takes this look inside, refreshes itself. And so the era we're in now is this era of taste the feeling. So let me share with you a little bit about how we got to where we got to. So when we came up with this campaign, we also decided to make what for us is a bold statement. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that probably if you're a consumer, but when you're a marketer on the inside, this was a big move where in the previous era, we had a brand Coca-Cola manager, we had a Coca-Cola Zero brand manager, we had a Coca-Cola Light brand manager, and each of these brands was ultimately trying to create its own way forward. We called them brands, sub-brands. And what we said is, you know what? If you like Coke, you don't want to be ostracized. You don't want to have to identify with a different brand identity if you're a zero drinker. Because ultimately, your reason for perhaps drinking zero is just simply that when you were younger, you were a lot more active. And so you could take a little bit more sugar in your diet. But if you're like me, who now also drinks a little bit of wine, I need to make some choices. Love the taste of Coke. Can't afford all the calories, so I drink Coke Zero. Why? Because I like a glass of wine or two with my dinner as well. But why do I have to then be ostracized to have this completely different brand identity? So what we said is, guys, let's make this simple for ourselves. Let's really bring ourselves back to what the brand ultimately was, which was one brand to really ensure that we could move the brand forward. So in January, what we launched was a new communication platform, which was Taste the Feeling. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of the thinking there. And slowly, over the next few months, we're also going to be rolling out our new brand identity, our visual identity, which basically, at the heart of it, is really bringing back one of the things that has been with us for decades. I talked about the package being unique. I talked about the Sanskrit logo being unique. One of the things that's also very much identified with brand Coca-Cola is the color red. And yet when you look at it, much of our packaging, other than the original, really has no red identity. And so we're looking, and we're going to be launching a new brand identity with our visual packaging as well. So, rather than trying to create this complexity of a bunch of different sub-brands, with a bunch of different identities, with a bunch of different brand managers, with a bunch of different budgets, creating massive inefficiency, we said, guys, let's give the consumer ultimately what they want, which is one brand that has a bunch of variants in it. And what we also, in that inner reflecting, started to realize was that our advertising over the last decade or so had gotten very poetic. Everybody knows that the world is all about storytelling these days. Oh, great presentations are about great storytelling. And that's what our advertising was. It was beautiful storytelling. But what would happen is in some advertisements, other than the pack shot or the logo at the end, you would never see the product in the ad. It got to the stage where in a country, I'll give you an example, in a country like Italy, we're sitting on the highest brand love in the world, and yet one of the lowest per capita consumptions in the world. People love the brand, they just don't drink it. And so what we started to say is, ultimately, we've got to go back to the roots of what we're about, which is we're a beverage company. You would never see a Nike ad without somebody wearing Nike apparel. So why would we do Coke advertising without somebody drinking a Coke? And that ultimately, what we said is when you see our advertising, it's got to trigger you to want to drink a Coke. Not just say, wow, that was beautiful advertising. And so what the marketing group did is kind of took a step back and really reinforce what were the values of the brand, the optimism I talked about, the happiness, the moments of joy. So how do we keep all of that, which was great in all the storytelling we did? In fact, that's what we were doing for several years, was just a lot of storytelling around happiness. Problem is, we're not in the happiness business. Although we want to be there in moments of happiness. And then how do we add that back to, by the way, the fact that we're sitting on a great tasting, unique product? And so the new campaign was not only about bringing the brand together, but it was going back to the basics of marketing, which is you got great brand benefits, put them together with your brand values, and now create advertising. And so ultimately, it was really about how do we ultimately remind ourselves and ensure that we reinforce with our consumers, not only is this a brand of optimism and happiness, but it's also great tasting. And so the brief to the agency was as simple as this. If we want people to love to drink Coca-Cola, let's do ads where people love to drink Coca-Cola. And that literally was at the core of the briefs that went back out to the 10 agencies which worldwide worked on the campaign. So the core creative idea that the agencies ultimately worked their creatives off of was the simple pleasure of drinking a Coca-Cola that makes moments special. Now, there's a lot of elements that went into what made the advertising then critical. One of the things is we wanted it. I talked about authenticity. It had to be moments where people could relate to it. We got to the stage where when we would get what we call the toolkits, when we would get the materials from global or the regional guys, you'd look at the stuff, whether it was the shopper material or the how-to-home material, and it was all very static. And what you wouldn't see is this, like a shot like this woman, you can literally feel yourself in this moment where they're laughing their asses off. Someone's either just told a joke or someone's reminded them of a great moment together, and they're doubled over laughing. That's authentic. And you can see and feel yourself there. So how do we get back to this kind of visualization? So at the heart of the campaign was reminding people about taste, talking about the refreshment that the brand gives, and then ultimately being there in these uplifting moments. So what I'd like to do is play now a few of the ads, and just before I do that, so what ended up happening was 10 agencies were brought together to ultimately pitch. 4 in the end agencies were chosen, their campaigns were chosen for the final of what we basically went global with. Those agencies were global in themselves. One from North America, Ogilvy. We had Latin America, as well as Spanish agencies that ultimately created what has now developed for us, which is about a year or 2 years worth of content around Taste the Feeling. So let's play this, and then I'll come back and talk about how do we take this into the digital world as well.
Never did believe.
This one is called Breakup.
What I couldn't see, darling, I was made for you.
Called Pressure, Under Pressure.
Under pressure.
called Supermarket.
Hi. Cold drinks?
Oh, you're in luck. It's happy hour. So, you've won another Coca-Cola for free, but you have to drink it in the store.
No one can stop this feeling.
So, still storytelling, still emotional moments, but a couple of things. First of all, the product very much at the heart of the story. 2, always drinking shots. 3, and perhaps I should have started with this, always based on very real, insightful moments. What did you think about the first one, Breakup, with the ultimate symbolism of the bottle breaking and that becoming the beginning of the breakup? Sorry? You almost cried. What do you think about taking your own product and smashing it on the ground? In that in itself is a little bit of an insight into, I talked about the package being 100 years old. The brief for the guy that designed the package was, the idea was you had to recognize the shape even if it was crushed into 1,000 pieces. And so even going back and using that bit of our heritage and using the symbolism of the bottle breaking into 1,000 pieces being the symbol of the breakup is kind of cool in the way that the brand can take its own heritage and weave it back in. I smiled when I saw the girl at the supermarket. When I was a young girl working, I used to work at a dry cleaners where they'd come and, you'd give your clothes in. And it's so true that as a teen, I grew up in Canada, and you can work when you're 13, 14, 15 years old. And I remember that, when I used to go home after work, the thing I'd always talk about with my friends was if any hot guys came in. So you smile at these moments, whether it's the breakup moment and she's going to, whether she's going to take his, if you will, lips off of the bottle, and then she says no because it's the symbolism of them getting back together. Each of these moments, we can kind of each go back to and say, yeah, I feel that. I ultimately feel when that was there. So, with every campaign, obviously we're still very much in the TV-centric world, and we're very much in the advertising era of still creating a lot of traditional material. But ultimately, we're moving more and more into what I talked about, which was the mixed screen world, and ultimately 2 things. One, which is how do we create digital content, and then 2, how do we create content that can create conversations so that our consumers can ultimately be our content generators. So we've done a lot of work in the area of moving towards digital. I mentioned also having Poland as one of our markets. So Poland is the market where today in Europe, the largest percentage of my marketing budget we spend in digital in all of Europe. We have a theory on how we look at our marketing budget. It's called 70-20-10. So 70% of your budget is against things you know will work. So when your media agency comes back and gives you their connection plan, it's going to be around traditional media mix. So you're going to have a certain amount in television and a certain amount in standard portals. news portals and what have you. You'll probably have a certain amount on Facebook. It's 70% where you know you can measure the ROI. 20% of the budget is around things that have worked somewhere. So it's an idea that perhaps you've taken from another brand or taken from another country, and you know it can work, but you're now going to look to try to scale it here against this brand or against this campaign. And then 10% of the budget is against complete innovation. Go and find where the leading edge is in areas. So about 3-4 years ago, we looked at the emerging element of Snapchat. We could see that young teens were really jazzed by this idea of Snapchat. Picture there, picture gone. And so about 2-3 years ago, we started to play around with Snapchat, to the point where today, on our 200 ml packaging in Poland, we actually have the Snapchat logo on there, and consumers can ultimately create and generate their content from that. Of the top 100 brands on Snapchat today, Coca-Cola is the leading FMCG brand. In fact, last month we were the leading brand overall. If we hadn't started the journey 3 years ago, 4 years ago, it was 3 years ago actually, well, it was about 2.5 years ago when we started to explore, we wouldn't have gotten to the stage today where that innovation and playing around and fine-tuning could get us to the top brand today on that platform. So this idea of 70-20-10, the digital world actually has a lot of space to play to find that next level of innovation. So as we look at how do we create content, this is an example. We call these Thirstygrams, and these are a few gifts that we'll just share with you in terms of having a little bit of fun with our own brand here. These are from our Spanish campaign, so you'll see oh, you won't see it. Okay. So I mentioned having a good percentage of our budget up against digital, increasingly more. I was in a media review about 2 weeks ago, and somebody asked me, did we have enough of our budget in digital? And the answer was no. We should probably have about 20% more than we do today, if not 30% more. And the question was, well, but why don't you? Then go and do it. Well, the issue is today that we as marketers, we're still not there in terms of generating enough content. You can't go into the digital space unless you've got the content, at least to get you started. And so what we're now working on is increasingly changing from our development from, yes, still having traditional advertising, but increasingly creating content where we can ultimately create more engagement. So we've moved a lot from an example in terms of how we're creating that content. So we've moved a lot from, let's say, traditional use of product placement and what have you. We still do a lot of that. But what we're increasingly doing is, rather than working only with sports figures and musicians and what have you, we've learned our way through working with influencers. When I first got into this job 2.5 years ago, I did the traditional meet with all the radio stations and the television stations and what have you. And I asked my team to set up some meetings with me with YouTubers. Thought, interested to see what that world was all about. And when we met with them, we realized that we understood very, very little. And so 2.5 years ago, what we did was we did a workshop, a teen workshop, where we got together with digital influencers. We got together with platforms, YouTube platforms and other digital platforms. And we ran a 2-day workshop to try to understand how could we better connect with ultimately our teens. And so we've had to learn our way on how to work with influencers, teen influencers. In many cases, we see that these guys have millions of followers, more so than even traditional sport and traditional music musicians. And yet, they don't necessarily have the traditional ways of going about their communication. They don't have a trade per se. It's not like a football player where the football player has a skill and you know it and you can build off of it. Here in the world of influencers, you're having to really work very, very closely with them and also give them a lot more freedom to work content for you. So in this concept of 70-20-10, working with influencers now, we've been able to not only get to areas where we are with Snapchat, but also do the same in other digital platforms, be that Facebook, be that YouTube, be that Instagram, looking for the next platforms and where we would connect with consumers. So the journey of how has Coca-Cola stayed relevant for 130 years? As I said, it comes really down to, I think, 2 things. One, which is relevance. How do we ensure that we stay relevant? And that means looking inside and admitting where we perhaps are getting out of touch. And we've done that, as I mentioned, with our new campaign, had to look at where we got a little bit too far away from our own brand and had to come back into the fray. And then the second thing is around insights. How do we develop relevant insights with teens, and where do we go to when we want to connect with those teens? And today in the multi-screen platform, it does mean that we have to be well beyond television, and in some cases, it means that we go with only digital platforms. So that's what I wanted to share with you today in terms of a little bit behind the scenes of Coca-Cola. Happy to answer questions afterwards, but thank you for being with me, and thank you for enjoying. Thank you very much.